As most of you know by now, that the basic purpose of this whole conference has been to develop the discipline of women's studies, ultimately the development of the discipline of women's studies in Pakistan, because it doesn't exist as yet, to give it a theoretical as well as an action base. And this whole conference has been geared toward that purpose. So basically, to define it very briefly, and basically, we're trying to develop alternative ways of knowing, seeing, and understanding the world and reality around us. And not only alternative ways of understanding the world around us, but alternative and new ways of acting upon it. Because we very strongly believe that action and movement are strongly connected to the way you think, your consciousness, and the way you understand and perceive reality. So on the first day, some general parameters were laid down, then within which we split into 4 groups, and I will briefly just describe those parameters. There was a question of challenging the dominant forms, ways of producing and distributing knowledge. That women's studies and feminism is seen as an alternative form of knowledge, critiquing the mainstream social science methods of doing and understanding knowledge, which we believe are strongly masculine, and looking at new ways of perceiving and apprehending reality, which are not so alienating, not so distancing, and not so exploitative. And of course, on that will depend our action. The other major purpose of this conference, apart from several others, has been to bring together all the fragmented aspects of the movement. The women's movement in Pakistan has been carried on not only in organizations, but in different ways through art and literature and creativity. And somehow it was very fragmented. The writers and poets never spoke to the social scientists, the psychologists had their own meetings, the economists had their own meetings, and people were very fragmented. This is the first time that people from the creative arts and literature and poetry and dance were brought together along with different social sciences so that there is an integrated, what we call a holistic view of reality. Because our educational system is constructed in such a way that we tend to have a fragmented view of reality, which tends in turn to fragment identity. If I see the world as a broken thing, as separate, discrete compartments, then I will act on it accordingly. I will not act in a holistic way. So identity is very closely related to how you look at the world. But that is the purpose here of dissolving those boundaries and making the linkages between different disciplines and ways of thinking. And I think the most important aspect in that has been to, on the first day, Bunny did a presentation on alternative views of development. In the mainstream development discourse everywhere, all over the world, it is looked at in extremely economistic terms, very narrowly economistic, not in a holistic sense. Development is looked at in terms of maybe technological development, and very sort of community-based income generation schemes and things like that, and has not been looked at as the development of the whole person, development of the self, the human being, the general discourse and the languages that you develop human resource potential or human resource development, in which once again the human being is looked upon as a resource that can be exploited, rather than development for the sake of the person. And as Bunny defined it, the development is an unfolding, it's an unfurling, it's a release of latent inner potentials to create, to be, to perform action upon the world. And that is the view that we are trying to promote by bringing together different disciplines, particularly the creative arts, like painting and poetry and literature, and integrating them with the so-called social sciences. And as Akia will explain in a short while, that the discipline of women's studies has, in Pakistan, is dominated by the social sciences, economics, psychology, whatever, but basically has emerged out of literature and history. The whole new concept of looking at knowledge differently has emerged basically out of literary theory, literature, and history. Akia will speak more about that. So we are looking at development in terms of an unfolding model of the whole person, spiritual, emotional, psychological development, and the potential for acting upon the world and developing an identity which will produce social change. Based on those parameters that we set on the first day, we split into 4 separate groups. One was women in development, the other was identity and ideology, the third was women writers and literature, and the fourth group was on women's movement. And this separation, compartmentalization was only done, because you can't have 60, 70 people in a workshop. Once again, the idea was not to fragment and not to separate. And therefore, there were some people who are more interested, say, in ideology, but were put in the development workshop. Some people who are basically development-oriented were in the identity workshops. So there was this intermixing so that a holistic view develops. And the first workshop, you heard the detailed reports yesterday, so I won't go into the details, but I will just briefly tie the threads that ran through the different workshops. In the development workshop, we basically split into 4 sub-themes, which were education, population, let me look at what the others were. The point is to overcome fragmentation. Education, class and control, peasant studies, and population. And in all these papers, there was a... In all these papers, there was... Now can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. And we made several papers were presented on 3 on education, and 4 on class and control, some on peasant struggles and peasant studies, and on population. And the attempts were made to link development with identity. We talked about how knowledge is constructed in the mainstream. Let me talk very briefly about that the way we are taught in the social sciences is to be very objective. We are taught that knowledge is unbiased, it should be detached, neutral. The person who's creating the knowledge has no relationship with the people being studied. The research and the researcher are distanced. And that is how we are taught, so that all bias and prejudice is eliminated. The whole discipline of women's studies and feminism is questioning that ideology of value, freedom, neutrality, distance, subject-object divide, and are trying to reconnect those who are doing the study with those who are being studied, which are considered not passive, inert objects of study, but active producers of the knowledge being done. So a connection, the reconnection between the subject and the object, and this whole ideology of objectivity, detached, neutral observation is being questioned, and connection of thought and feeling, because in the traditional discourse of social sciences, the idea, it's very masculinist. The idea is that the object is inert, and emotions are undermined, values are undermined, and there is emphasis on being impersonal, objective, and rational at the expense of emotionality, subjectivity, and we're trying to reclaim subjectivity as being important and reclaim emotion and values as being important in research. And you can never be a value-free researcher because you always have a position, you always come from some position. So this was discussed particularly in the education papers, on the paper on education and science and the ideologies of education. In population, we basically focused on the fact that it shouldn't be women who are the targets of population control, that there is a whole system, international system of wealth and income distribution, which is affecting the way that the population discourse is being carried on. It is, women are being targeted and being blamed for too many children, and we looked at it differently in terms of the consumption patterns of the whole world, in terms of the north-south divide, inequality of wealth in the world, and the pressures on third world poor women to produce more children, which are economic. So we looked at that holistically, and not as in terms of tell these women not to produce more children. And then, in class and control, we discussed the issues of how laws are not neutral, because the state is not neutral. The state is an entity which is based on those who are powerful. Societies are structured, societies are unequal. Therefore, the state reflects the interests of those who have power. As we can see in our own parliaments and judiciary and executive, it is filled by a certain class and not everyone. So therefore, laws are not neutral, and Hina Jalani made a very good presentation on showing how laws are designed to control you, and to organize your sexuality and your way of being in the world, and that laws are repressive and oppressive and not always in your favor. And from that we went into a critique of the state and of patriarchy and of the family, because Hina particularly pointed out how the state and family mutually reinforce each other. Alright, I'll go a little bit faster because I know you heard the reports yesterday, but trying to make the linkages, I'll come on to the one on ideology and identity. In that also several papers were presented, and I think the main things that came out were that they also did a critique of knowledge, the idea of the subject and object not being so divided. And so there was this linkage between development and ideology there. And they also did a critique of the state. And there were papers on how the state is a very masculine identity. The nation state has the underlying discourse is extremely masculine, extreme concern with private property, and extreme concern with masculinist ideals. And there were papers on how the social science discourse as well as the traditional discourse, they are both, fundamentalist discourse and scientific discourse are both actually strongly masculine in nature. So there's the connection, and how the identities are multiple in the sense that you're Pakistani, woman, and South Asian, Muslim, and how they interact, overlap, and contradict one another. So identity is very strongly connected to development, because how you participate in your own development and in country's development is strongly dependent on how your identity is constructed and mediated through and by the state. The third workshop was writers and literature, and from that it came out, none of us were actually clear on what came out of that workshop, but the idea was that it was the first time that the creative arts and creativity and literature were being brought into the discourse on development and identity, because a large part of the identity is also related to your creativity. And in the traditional mainstream development discourse has never looked at creativity and literature and art and painting as forms of development, and theatre as forms of development, that these are essential parts of human development, not just resource development, because the traditional view of development takes the state as the important entity and the individual is not important. In our discourse, that the development of the person is more important than just the development of states, because that means development of particular classes. And finally, there was the workshop on movement, in which again there were a lot of things. And the point was, we were hoping that all the other three workshops on identity and on development and on creativity and literature would feed into the movement. That the movement doesn't just consist of a particular organization or of just going out on the streets and activism, that the movement is everything. Any creative artist creating anything that has emancipatory potential is the movement. And a person writing a story is movement, a person doing a painting is part of the movement. So the movement was also conceived in a very holistic sort of a manner, in terms of total development of the personality and unfolding, and not just, the movement is not just sort of marching on streets or storytelling or whatever, that everything you do, even at a personal individual level, which somehow challenges prevailing dominant structures, is part of the movement.